Hello. This is an interview for Cast in Stone. My name is Dr. Nathaniel Adam Tobias Coleman, and I'm joined by, would you please introduce yourself by name, your profession, and any associations or groups that you're part of that are relevant to this interview?
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Jendayi Serwah. I am an independent consultant as well as a reparations activist. I'm a co-founder of the John Lynch African Education Program, established in 1990 with a mission on cultural education for liberation. I'm also more recently co-founder of Afrikan ConneXions Consortium that came out of mine and other involvements in the Global African People's Parliament. And Afrikan ConneXions Consortium is also Bristol-based, as well as the John Lynch African Education Programme, named after one of our ancestors who lived in Bristol. So Afrikan ConneXions Consortium, though, ACC, is about substantive African representation and positioning for power in city affairs, and promoting and elevating in the interests of African heritage communities. And we are focused also on building through that a reparations plan with our community.
Thank you very much and welcome. The purpose of our interview is to discuss your perspective on the statue of Edward Colston in Bristol. Please tell me how you came to be interested in the statue of Edward Colston. What brought it to your attention?
Well, I think the first thing for me is I don't know that I am interested, but that is perhaps the point of this conversation. I was born in Bristol. I consider myself an African born in Bristol. And so the whole thing around the statue, I think probably for the last couple of decades, has been a subject of much angst in Bristol generally around its presence, and a lot of people finding it offensive, and a lot of people also wanting it to remain where it was in the city centre of Bristol. As a reparations activist, as someone who, has been working for the last 30 odd years in Bristol around elevating the knowledge of self in our communities and what that should then yield for us going forward in terms of reclamation as an aspect of reparation. It's always been on the radar, and for us, as in John Lynch, it was about, actually, we have a history which goes way beyond the period of enslavement colonization. And we were much more focused on learning more concrete lessons about our past to inform our future, which is why the Sankofa bird became our logo. So, and retrieving the past for liberation now was our motto. So, it wasn't something that we as an organization, or even I as an individual, because I rarely kind of speak as an individual, what was too concerned with, because you've got different things that remind you of things, good and bad, in the city. The point was, what do you choose to focus on? And that's why I say it wasn't a concern to ACC in particular. It wasn't a concern to John Lynch as an organization, because we wanted people to understand our greater, more significant contribution to society, not as a conquered and colonized people, but that we have a pre-colonial history which actually is exponentially longer than the period of enslavement and colonization. So that's why I say, had it really interested me? No. Did I have strong feelings about it? For that reason, no, because there are other symbols, other places, other buildings, architecture. Oh, it's in Bristol. We know Bristol's history. But I'll say more about that later on. But I think in more recent years, prior to the toppling of 2020, in June 2020, sorry, I should say, I knew of colleagues and campaigners, the Countering Colston movement, for example, who specifically had intentions around getting rid of that statue or kind of redefining the narrative on the plaque, which I know has gone through various conversations. But again, it wasn't anything that made me think personally that I needed to get more involved and get behind it and shout it from the rooftops. And I'm happy to explain why. If you want me to do that now, because I know you've got a set of questions and I might end up answering all of them all at once.
Please explain why.
Because speaking personally now, for a long time in my adult life, I've had this thing about when people, I think it was Maya Angelou who said it, when people show you who they are, believe them the first time. And so for a long time, because of the work of John Lynch, because of the personal study, and my own quest to know more about myself, my history, my culture, the things that we had lost because of this period of the Ma'angamizi enslavement, colonization, neocolonialism. It just spoke to me as the nature of a people. It's necessary for Europeans, from their perspective, to promote the best of themselves and the best of their history. Okay. And I think most people, human nature says to us, that's what we should do. So even if that means trampling on, committing genocide, enslaving people, colonizing spaces, subjugating people, if there's some way that even for their perspective, the good, quote unquote, that come out of that can be elevated through this statue and other symbols of that, then that's what they will do, because for them, and the people that erected Colston and the people that wanted his statue to stay, it was a good thing. So I'm saying, okay, I see you. That's it. I see you. And I know what you want. And actually, for you, the reasons why it should stay is stronger than the reasons why it should go. So for me, that is a teachable moment to our people. That is a teachable moment that tells you, when people show you who they are, believe them the first time. Now, you could argue not all Europeans, because there were some people, past and present, that objected to the statue. I know this. But it was an institutional decision to erect it, and an institutional decision to keep it there, even when it was contested in recent decades. So again, when people show you who they are, take note. So for me, the statue of Colston, or anyone else that has a dodgy background for whatever reason, should stand as a teachable moment for all types of people, because we are all, to varying levels, in denial. We are all to various levels have this amnesia that we'd rather forget about, stuff. And I find it actually, because with Colston, you find a lot of people not only objecting to the statue, but the things that are named after him.
Mm-hmm.
So the hall, the street, the school, for example. Yeah, Colston Girls, Colston Boys, Colston Street, Colston Hall, etc. Right? Because they found it offensive because of what he did, and so on and so forth. I'm like, okay, so your name is Smith, Jones, Brown, Williams, Coleman, whatever. Where are you with that then? Where are you with that? Because to me, to carry the name in my legal personality is much more offensive than some damn statue that most people walk past and didn't even know what it was anyway. Yeah? So if we got problems with this, if that's such an affront to you, then your flipping name on your passport, on your birth certificate, should be an affront to you also. Yeah? And more so, you can definitely do something about that. And you don't want to. So what's with that? So I think sometimes we want to focus on something that actually sometimes, in some ways, when it comes to African heritage people, it can take away from ourselves. Yeah. And for those racialized as white, maybe European, they want to have a positive recollection and association with their history, and that's very difficult if you come from, if you are white British or white European. That's very difficult because the global north has a terrible history in the main. That means in order for it to have what it has and be where it is and do what it does on the global stage of life is 9 times out of 10 at the expense of the subjugation, exploitation of people in the global south. So I see their problem. Because they haven't got a lot really to be proud of. They haven't got a lot. Because most things in the last 1,000 years has really not been good for them, and how they've come by most of what they have, if you do process thinking. How does the Bank of England end up with gold in its vaults when there's no gold mines in the UK? For example, how do you end up with all these grand buildings and all this money and all this technology when there's certain things actually you don't even have for yourself? So where did you get it from? And how did you get it? Okay, so when you do process thinking, because I remember being in primary school, secondary perhaps, learning about the spinning jenny and the Industrial Revolution and all of that. I had no idea about my people in that context and how all of that became possible because of my ancestors. I had no idea. But if I was taught to process think at that time and go back into how did Hargreaves do this thing and all the others back in the day, you get to a point and it's like, actually this is becoming uncomfortable for us now, because it's like swimming like oil on water and the guilt is just rising up And it's just becoming so apparent that we have to sanitize this whole thing. So we can't go too far with any of this, because basically our people look like shit. You know, our people, the powers that be, the poor people that benefited from this whole exploitation don't look too good in that light. And so I can't even remember the question you asked me now. but
Let me then
that's
take
why
you on
it's kind of so not important in a way.
Yes.
For me, because it's one symbol, and where that one comes down, there's probably 100 others that are propped up in Bristol or elsewhere that tell a story, and that story must be told. And if Britain was to strip itself of everything that it got through ill-gotten gains, through unjust enrichment, it would have jack shit. It would have not much left. It would be a so-called third world country. France knows this already. They're more honest about it. Yeah. And we see what's happening in West Africa at this time. So they know. So a statue, really, in the scheme of things, come on.
This is very helpful. Thank you. You mentioned that the statue was toppled in June 2020.
Yes.
And that was during a Black Lives Matter protest. To what Black voices, from your perspective, were raised during that protest? What Black voices have been raised, and if they are different, what African voices were raised during the protest, or what African voices have been in the history of the statue raised in contestation against it?
Black Lives Matter did very little for Black people. Okay, let me start there. The whole Black Lives Matter thing in the UK was an opportunity for those soft power, white supremacist institutions to pretend that they are doing something about racism and being shocked by the murder of George Floyd. What it also did was give a space for white people, ordinary white people, to engage in performative allyship. Okay. So that Black Lives Matter movement, then and since and before, was a very reactionary one. So every time something came of note that actually had national attention, Black Lives Matter would pop up. There's several people who have been killed before and since Trayvon Martin, since George Floyd. You've not heard from them, because I actually feel like those stories are perhaps not high profile enough for them to come out and take to the streets, and all this bloody taking the knee nonsense. I mean, come on. You know, it's that's the worst level of performative allyship. You know, even in the Premiership, where they couldn't kick racism out of football, but all of a sudden they're taking the damn knee. What for? How has that systemically changed anything? The Black Lives Matter in the UK didn't do that either, but gave organizations, whether it's the Premier League, whether it's big charities, whether it's bus companies and all these corporations who wanted to be seen to be doing something, to be seen to be doing something. And so I don't have a lot of time for BLM.
And yet the statue was toppled during a BLM protest.
Yes.
What sort of Black or African voices, from your perspective, were being raised around the toppling?
So at the rally, which I wasn't at, I was aware of and met since with some of the young Black men who wanted to establish an African Youth Assembly. Okay, so that's one of the things that came out of that. And we have recordings of young Black people talking about Black people, call it that, needing to be self-determined, and we need our own government, and we need to do this, and we need to do that. And that kind of ran for a while, as in the idea and the group, and then it fizzled out. And I know that there were Black people, call it that, who were also involved in the toppling of the statue, because it's not just 4 people that dragged that thing for, I don't know, it was quite a way from the center to the waterside. I imagine it's about, I don't know, a good quarter of a mile, as a crow flies.
Why do you think then that 4 people racialized as white have turned out to be the Colston Four, if there was Black or African participation in the toppling?
Well, I don't know why they 4 in particular. I don't know, because presumably there would be a lot of footage, and it would show the amount of people involved. There are photos as well. Yeah. So some people, I think, got off cautioned and stuff, but those 4 young people, as I understand it, came from quite privileged backgrounds, didn't have a history of activism, and like a lot of people that kind of rallied around this BLM identity, just kind of rise up in that moment and do stuff. So there's this thing around premeditation, you know, and having ropes and stuff at the ready. Whether it was those 4 people, I don't know. Whether they understood what the consequences of that would be, whether they what their intentions were in toppling it, because I didn't follow the case that closely, because it's kind of because Colston itself as a statue was a distraction from bigger and deeper things in society that we need to change. Colston is a symbol of that. Then these people become the Colston Four, the very name that you want to get rid of. We're now identifying these people and somehow putting them up as some kind of hero and heroines because they're the one that's going through the legal process, and we knew the outcome of that. So I don't know why them 4. I really don't. It's a good question though.
We knew the outcome of that. What do you mean?
As in they were charged and then they were acquitted. So there was no further action. They yeah. They weren't found guilty. So, yeah.
I'm still thinking about African or Black voices being raised in Bristol, and I'm thinking about surveys or consultations that have been done in the wake of the statue toppling. Yeah. Could you please tell me what, from your perspective, is the We Are Bristol History Commission?
Okay.
And in what ways it differs from or is similar to the Legacy Steering Group or the Bristol Legacy Group?
Right. So, again, I think that was probably a bit of a reactionary thing on the part of our mayor to set up a history commission. The Legacy Steering Group already existed, now known as the Bristol Legacy Group. And again, name change pending on that too. But his intention, as I understand it, was to create a space where different perspectives and different history could come together. The History Commission wasn't set up just to address the Colston issue, but that was kind of like the first thing on its to-do list. That's what I understand. So I think that's that up until probably last year. I'm not sure when the report of the survey came out. It took up all their time. So these 14,000 people that had responded to the survey and actually showing how divided people were. It was almost 50-50, pros and cons, sort of leave it up, take it down type of thing, and what should happen with it next. And I think it's a great piece of work, and then what should happen with it now that it's not going back up. So what then happened was a display in the Shed Museum for a period of time, with the statue as was recovered from the dock, with its graffiti on and everything, and it was displayed horizontally, so not erected as it was stood up before. So
what contribution did you make to the survey conducted by the We Are Bristol History Commission, and what's your perspective on the temporary exhibition at the Shed?
I think the History Commission did a great job on what they did. To be honest, Nathaniel, I'm not sure. I don't have a memory of actually going to see it. But I might have. It's literally that not important to me that I can't remember if I went to see it. But give me the question again.
Oh, if you went to see it, what did you think? And when the survey came out, did you fill out the survey?
I did.
And if so, what did you say?
Yeah, and I think what I said was pretty much what I'm saying to you today.
And to what extent? Please,
to what extent?
To what extent do you think African descended people in Bristol or elsewhere filled out the story, and what sense do you get of what they might have said in their responses?
I remember, because the History Commission came to the Legacy Steering Group and kind of reported on the findings before it became public. Now, I'm struggling to remember the data on that, because the one that sticks out in my mind the most was that people were still kind of very much divided on whether it should have stayed and whether it should have been taken down. So my memory, unfortunately, is a bit sketchy, but the History Commission knew through its journey that it should actually be deferring to the Legacy Group on a lot of things, because the Legacy Group had a remit around broader issues of memorialization and legacy and repair, which is much bigger than a statue. So there was an idea, I think, a thought at one time to either collapse the History Commission or to have greater synergy between the Legacy Group and the History Commission. And someone like Asha Craig would answer that question much better, because she chairs a Legacy Group, and obviously being deputy mayor of Bristol was much more in tune with that particular narrative. So I think there was a significant turnout, from my memory, of African heritage, whether it's defined as Caribbean or Black or whatever, within the survey, which I find interesting. But what I also remember is that a lot of us racialized in that way were actually not bothered. And I find I don't know if I find it interesting because that
not bothered about the statue, or not bothered enough to fill out the form?
they fill out the form, but they're not bothered too much about what should happen in the future, because it wasn't a case of they weren't being asked, should it be erected again? The survey was about what should happen next. How should we account for this history? And so how it ended up was this temporary display at M-Shed with these narratives around the statues on around the statue on different boards. I don't have a vague memory of seeing it, but
now you've mentioned the Legacy Steering Group, or the Bristol Legacy Group, or perhaps it has a new name. And you've mentioned it as having been initiated by Deputy Mayor Asher Craig. Could you tell me, how did the Legacy Steering Group come into being? Who is or was on it? And what has been its working methodology and activities and chief achievements?
So let me go back to 2007. That was the commemoration of the bicentenary of the abolition of the so-called trade. That's not a word I use, actually, to describe what happened to my ancestors, because a trade implies a kind of equitable exchange. And it wasn't that. It was murder, genocide, kidnapping, rape, exploitation, etc. So we talk about the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans, because also labeling people as slaves is very dehumanizing. And enslavement is a condition, it's not an identity. Anyway, so Bristol City Council, in their wisdom, decided back then that they would allocate 750,000 coming out of this commemoration to communities, I guess. So at that point, because I was a campaigner against that commemoration as well, through a campaign called Operation Truth 2007, because the narrative was really about Britain patting itself on the back for abolition. So we called it Wilberforce. And we started we developed this statement of non-compliance around the whole plans for it, which would culminate in this wonderful service in Bristol Cathedral, or whatever it is, on College Green. So I was outside with my placards, but the majority of us were inside the church, because as usual, you've got different opinions and you've got different levels of capture, and people were captured, as far as I'm concerned, and co-opted into this thing. Some of them to take part in that service, and some of them to also become part of the Bristol Legacy Commission, as it was called then. So that group of people, I think, met for 3 years. And I cannot tell you where one penny, what the outcome of even one penny of that money, I can't tell you. That is part of the problem. Because back in that day, you could do something significantly with £750,000. But the way it was dealt with, I really couldn't tell you what we have in Bristol to show for that investment. Okay. Mm-hmm. So then eventually it went away. And then towards the middle of 2015, I don't know what they call these decades now, after the noughties, I don't know what they so the late 2015 onwards, okay, I think this whole idea of history and Britain and enslavement kind of was gaining popularity in all sorts of ways. Because even we in London, although I live in Bristol, I became the chair of the African Emancipation Day Reparations March Committee in 2015, and the first reparations march was in 2014. So in other spaces, it was very much not so much from an angle of exploring reparations to what it is now. I think reparations has become fashionable, and discussions around that. But back then, less so. It was more about organizations and stuff in investigating their own roles in and how they had benefited from the enslavement of African people. And it became an area of study and something that, well, even in your field of academia, because the first professor of slavery was in Bristol, Olivet Otelli, and so that would have been the late 2018-ish time. So this whole thing is becoming more popular, is what I'm saying. So you then found yourself, or Bristol found itself, in a position where the University of Bristol was doing this, not quite sure what it was. University of West England was doing that. And then you had these pronouncements, I think Green King, Lloyd's, whoever else. And then you had the merchant venturers in Bristol, Society of Merchant Venturers, also one of these people that, couldn't run away from that fact, as well as the counter in Colston. It all kind of elevated this, oh my gosh, not just, the UK is built on something, but Bristol is also too as a port city, blah, blah, blah. So they all started to do their own thing around, whether it's researching or whatever, about their own institutional kind of involvement and organizational involvement in that history and how they had or may have benefited. And their stuff came out about the individual families. I'm not sure what year the UCL that database came out, but it's all, I think, within the last 8 years, from 2015 to now. All of that stuff has kind of just been coming up. So Asher Craig, Deputy Mayor of Bristol, said, look, we're going to bring you all together. We're going to bring you all together. We're going to have this conversation so that you're not just out there doing your own thing. And more importantly, you're not doing anything without the express wishes of the community in question, as in African heritage communities who had been impacted by this history. So you can't do something about us without us. Yeah. So she brought everyone around the table. And in fact,
and when you say everyone around the table, who was around?
Organizations, institutions. So City Council, the universities, the church, etc., as well as Black-led organizations and interested individuals. And there were a few, 2 or 3 maybe, very well attended, heated meetings. I think initially she asked me, and I think I know, she asked me to chair this new legacy steering group, and I refused because I wanted to be around the table. And when you're chairing something, if you're a good chair, you enable other voices to come into the room. So I'd have to silence my own. And I'm not going to do that.
So who did chair?
Olivet Otelli.
Okay.
So Olivet chaired for a couple of years, possibly. Not sure how long. I could be wrong on that. I really don't know. But then, as you know, had her own struggles with her university. Eventually left that role and left Bristol and stood down from the chairship of that. And then Asher took it on. Councillor Asher Craig, Deputy Mayor, took it on as chair. And that's what it's been ever since.
And in 2020, Deputy Mayor Asher Craig was the chair.
In 2020, she was probably, yes, because
Why?
And by then, that's the year that Marvin would have set up the History Commission. Yeah.
Why do you think her colleague, Mayor Marvin Rees, set up an alternative, a second commission to deal with something that may have fallen under the remit of the already existing commission that was chaired by his colleague, Deputy Mayor Asher Craig?
Well, this is why I say to you that the History Commission wasn't just focused with Bristol's involvement in the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans. There were other issues, and I really don't remember what they were, that Marvin wanted to make sure was the business of this commission, because there had been some narratives going around that needed to be either corrected or elevated. So that was just one of the things. The History Commission wasn't just about Bristol's role in the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans. So that's why I think, and I don't speak for Asher, but because it became a major part of what they would do initially, you could argue, and I think she felt it should have come under the Legacy Steering Group. But because it had a wider historical remit, and that was the initial intention, I think, by the mayor, that's why you had the two separate things, because one is specific, as in the Legacy Group, the History Commission wider than that. Mm-hmm. So but when it kind of finished that initial work and did the survey, did the report, did the the temporary display and all of that, they then I think came up with 4 or 5 recommendations, which I don't remember, but they were very short. And one of those was about, collapsing, I think, that aspect of their work into and recognizing that it belongs with the steering group, with the Legacy Group. And that has been said when Tim Cole and Sean Sobers had come from the History Commission into the Legacy Group to report on the work of the History Commission. Yeah.
So the Legacy Steering Group engaged in its own surveys and consultations, yes, and public engagement, and produced its own report, Project Truth. Yes. Could you tell me how you went about your consultations, and what were the main learnings in your report?
So the Bristol Legacy Group had a kind of Project Truth steering group, myself, Ruth Pitter, Tunga Witter representing BSWN, and Sado Jerdy, and Cleo Lake. We had decided that if we are saying the primacy of the voices of the affected communities are the most important, we need to then speak to them about what they want, because this had not been done in Bristol before. All the work that, everyone else had been done, nobody said to the impacted community, what do you think? And that's kind of what you get when you have a people that's not respected in that way. People will work around you and do stuff, and people say, well, we could offer this and that, and we're like, hang on a minute, did you even ask us what we wanted? But you're offering. It's always that kind of thing. So that small group of people, the steering group, kind of got together to put together the the proposal for a consultant to carry out a consultation with African heritage communities in Bristol. So that didn't include Clio at the time. So we came up with the brief, basically, and the initial 15,000, I think, came from Bristol City Council to BSWN to hold that purse to pay for the consultant to do this. And that consultation was over a 6 to 9 month period, culminating in a launch of the report in January 2021. And I remember it being online because I think we were still in the pandemic thingy. So there were focus groups, there was a survey. So there were focus groups for young people, academics, creatives, and general focus groups as well for like anybody. There was also a weekly radio show. And so we appointed Cleo Lake to be the person that would lead on all of this. So she did a weekly show on Ujima Radio called Project Truth. We had decided the name, Truth standing for telling, restoring, understanding our tapestry and history. So that's what Project Truth stands for. Because we had a range of kind of titles for stuff, and that's what we eventually arrived at, which I think was a proposal put forward by Ruth Pitter, actually. So we employed her, or we steered her, if that's the correct word, as a steering group. She as the consultant. She would do. We helped her to construct the survey questions and to do the analysis, and in the writing the report, particularly the recommendations. She would facilitate the focus groups. I think some were in person, some were online, I think. And as I said, she would do the radio show as well. I'm trying to think of how many respondents. I really can't remember now.
I was going to ask you that, in fact. And the survey itself, is that available? And the data from the survey, is that available? Yes,
the Project Truth report is available on the Black Southwest Network website. So the full report is there. And as I said, we had an online launch January 2021. So the Bristol.
To what extent is the raw data available? The actual submissions, is that going to be deposited, for instance, with Bristol Archives or something like that?
I don't know. I don't know, actually. And that's a good question, because, BSWN do a lot of their own research, and I suspect whatever happens with their raw data, the same is going to happen with this, unless the city council is going to hold it themselves, which would not be advisable, because we've got a change of administration coming up in May, and we don't want anything to be lost. Particularly as we know stuff like this doesn't have that level of importance as road and traffic and clean air and schools and blah blah blah, whatever. Anyway, carry on.
What were the most important findings or learnings that you drew from the consultation in your report?
Right.
And in what ways do the learnings in your report, Project Truth, differ from, or are they similar to the learnings or the recommendations in the report of the We Are History Bristol Commission?
Right. So to answer the last question first, the History Commission had about 4 or 5 recommendations, which I can't remember what they are, but because they're just focused on a statue and what should happen with it, I don't see that there would be much of a relationship between the detail of the recommendations on that and Project Truth. With Project Truth, two things that came out of it was the need for education, was this kind of tusslings with identity, and support for memorialization. And so the Bristol Legacy Group are concerned with that memorialization as the first implementation of those recommendations. So that's where the group is at now. It's got 4 task groups. One of them is about an artistic memorial. And so there's a process around that, which is, you know.
And what exactly you're trying to commemorate or memorialize?
It's that broad, how do we acknowledge Bristol's role in the transatlantic trafficking? How do we remember our ancestors? How do we recognize the horror of that period in history? So it's both those things.
And to what extent are you likely to choose a statue for your memorial?
I think that's very unlikely, because one of the things that came up in the consultation was these whole ideas around something other than a statue. So people were talking about, that's why I mentioned the art installation, but also things like gardens and fountains and places. That kind of came up, and then a delegation from the Legacy Group did some stuff, went to see how stuff was being done in Berlin and Hanover. That's in France, isn't it?
Hanover, Germany.
Hanover, I knew that. Right. Yeah. Hanover.
Why, in your opinion, did people in your circle take against statues in preference to these other forms of memorialization? What is it about a statue that means that it's not an appropriate way in which to memorialize what you want to memorialize?
I can't confirm that there was a strong we don't want a statue, but I think during the whole consultation we were clear was encouraging people to think outside of the box, because that's normally what people do. I didn't detect any kind of adversity to the idea or adverseness to the idea because of Colston, if that's what you're getting at. It was just like, well, everybody does that. You know, does it have to be that? We can do something different and actually make it more meaningful, which is why the second part of the memorialization is going to take the form of a story house. And it's called a story house because the deputy mayor and others are keen for it not to be seen as a museum. It's something that the vision for it is more than a place where you go and look at stuff and get a talk. It's a place where your stories are told, where learning and healing can take place. It's a stuff where legacy building can also take place. So the contemporary kind of manifestations of that history can also be explored as well. So it's not just about, you know, this 200-300 year period. So a place for telling stories and a place for learning, a place for healing, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of like the
museum.
Sorry?
And museums as they stand, or museums in Bristol, do not currently do the things that you would expect a story house to do, and could not be are not capable of doing that. This is a question.
I think so, because my experiences of going to museums is that you look at something, you might read what's underneath it, you're kind of left to your own devices. It's kind of like pretty decontextualized. You know, you go and you look at a painting or an object, and you got to make sense of it for yourself. And if you lack the ability to do so for whatever reason, then you're just going to be looking at something, and it's not something. Museums are places where you don't feel. You're not going there to feel as well. The story house is going to be something that's much more human, I would say, in having those senses evoked by it. But I'm talking from my experience as being a legacy group members representing Afrikan ConneXions Consortium, and these are the kind of things that I would be feeding in to the vision, because it hasn't been fully decided yet. There's been no location and all of that. So at the moment, things are like ideas. Yeah, we're going to do this, but we don't quite know yet. The other task group is a reparatory justice task group, and that is much more concerned with legacy. And in fact, the vision for what Bristol should have is even bigger than a story house and an artistic memorial. And that's the creation of something called Zenzele Village. And that's coming from Afrikan ConneXions Consortium as a way of institution building for our people, as a means to be self-determined and self-reliant, and being able to defend and feed and protect itself from the very institutions that continue to fail us and will do so, because that's what they're set up to do. So a lot of us are kind of have hope in an inclusion agenda, but there are limitations to that. And African heritage people will not regain their Africanness, their legal personality, and their power and presence in the world through inclusion into white supremacist systems.
This is my last question, Jendayi. Please do feel free to add if there is anything that you feel that my questions haven't enabled you to say, to add those comments afterwards. My final question is, we've spoken about Black Lives Matter and Black voices. We've spoken about the Legacy Steering Group and African Heritage Voices. To what extent, in your opinion, have either Black voices that have been raised in Bristol in contestation of the statue, or African heritage voices that have been raised in Bristol in contestation of the statue, or in general, to what extent have these voices been listened to?
Oh, that's a difficult one, because a lot of the campaigners, I would say, is a pretty mixed bag. If you talk about people racialized as white and black, right? It's been fairly equal, if not predominantly white. And I think that's kind of a reflection in many African heritage people being nonplussed by a statue. Because let's face it, we've got bigger fish to fry on a day-to-day basis in our lives. And that's part of the legacies of racism that we face, you know. So, but I think if they contributed to the survey, then the History Commission and the way that it dealt with the overarching voice of how the statue should remain part of Bristol's history, that's certainly been listened to. But what I can't say is the extent to which those voices are African heritage community voices. I think in terms of the Bristol Legacy Group, there are a number of organisations and individuals around the table, but haven't actually been overly concerned. It's not a topic of conversation that comes up as a great area of concern within that group, even, you know, when it first was restarted, you know, 2018, 2019, thereabouts. But some of the people I think, who have been involved actively, like Cleo Lake, possibly, I'm not sure, Rosie or Ros Martin, and the Radical History Group. Some of those people were around the Legacy Steering Group table at the time, and some of them, well, the Radical History Group, I haven't seen of them for quite some time now. So, but again, those are predominantly people racialized as white as well.
Could you, just because you've mentioned it, are you at liberty to say why it was that Bristol Radical History Group left or is no longer part of the Bristol Legacy Group?
I'm not sure. I know that on behalf of Afrikan ConneXions Consortium, I raised the issue around equity of voices around the table. So for us, it didn't mean that white people should not be there, but it means they should come in humility and come and listen, because there was a push from certain groups to have their ideas taken on. And they weren't working in the spirit of recognizing and respecting, as a first point, the voices of the impacted community. So I don't know if something like that made them withdraw. And I do know that there was a particular security breach, something that had been said in one of our meetings was said outside of a meeting, and that caused a bit of a conflict. So I don't know if those things led them to withdraw from the meeting, because I think some of them, I'm not entirely sure, but we're pushing this thing called Abolition Shed, and that group was a predominantly white group, and they weren't around the table of the Bristol Legacy Group when they were pushing that particular thing.
And Abolition Shed is different from Story House.
Oh, absolutely. I think, I mean, it's something, Abolition Shed as an idea. I think Cleo Lake was definitely involved in it at one point. Was around before the Legacy Steering Group reformed itself in 2019. So Abolition Shed, as far as I understood it, spoke to highlighting resistance and abolition, but it wasn't something that was being led by our community, African heritage communities. I don't know what's happened to it, because it was reported in the press, might have been earlier this year or last year, that they'd found some building that they wanted it to be in. Don't know. And this is what happens when you're not around the table and you're not talking about the input to the impacted communities about what should happen, or you're not referring to the recommendations of Project Truth, which are the voices of our people.
Jendayi Serwah, thank you for sharing with me your perspective on the statue of Edward Colston.
You're most welcome.
I'll turn off the recording now, unless there's anything else that you'd like to say.
No.
Okay.